all our students, university lecturers, professors, and other participants in our webinar. Today, the Department of History and Civilization at the International Islamic University in Malaysia is organizing a webinar with the title Colonizing Kashmir, State Building Under Indian Occupation. We are honored to have with us Dr. Hafsa Kanjwal. Dr. Hafsa, she's an associate professor in the Department of History and Lafayette College, Easton, Pennsylvania. She teaches courses on the modern world, South Asian history, and Islam in the modern era. Dr. Hafsa is the author of a book, Colonizing Kashmir, State Building Under Indian Occupation, which this book explores how Indian and Kashmiri governments used state building to entrench India's colonial occupation of Kashmir after partition. Her book examines the processes such as emotional integration, development, normalization, and empowerment, revealing new forms of power and domination in the post-colonial period. Dr. Hafsa was awarded the 2025 Bernard Cohen Prize for the first book on South Asia by the Association for Asian Studies. We are very honored to have Dr. Hafsa with us so that she can enlighten us about the process of colonization of Kashmir. And her presentation is very relevant for the time that we live in. A few weeks ago, we witnessed a major military escalation between India and Pakistan. And this is not the first time that both these South Asian countries, they go and fight each other. So in order to better understand and explain to our students and colleagues the history of the Kashmiri conflict, we are very honored to have Dr. Hafsa here. Dr. Hafsa, welcome. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for being on this call. And thank you so much, Dr. Olsi, for your kind introduction. I just wanted to let everyone know that I wasn't well a few days ago. My voice completely went away. It's just coming back, but it might mean that I might have to stop, drink some water, maybe cough. And I hope that you can bear with me for that. And yes, I'm looking forward to speaking to you about my book, and also looking forward to your questions. So let me just bring up my slides. Okay. Are you all able to see my slides?
Yes, we can.
You can. Okay, perfect. Okay, so my book, Colonizing Kashmir, State Building Under Indian Occupation, was published in 2023. So it's been almost in July 2023, so it's almost been 2 years. But I'm hoping to kind of give you an overview of the book, and then I'm happy to give more examples and answer any additional questions that you may have. So I'll begin. If you read or hear Indian state officials, journalists, and commentators talk about the region of Kashmir, you will often hear the phrase that Kashmir is an integral part of India. The repetition reaches a hysterical frenzy and seems to be the one thing that everyone across the political spectrum, from the Nehruvian secularists to the right-wing Hindu nationalists, can agree on. Challenging this mantra, my book examines how Kashmir was made integral to India. Building on recent interventions in the field of critical Kashmir studies, Colonizing Kashmir historicizes India's relationship with Kashmir as a colonial occupation and argues that one of the key mechanisms of effective control by which this occupation took place was through the installation of client regimes, as well as the particular forms of state building and governance that took place under these regimes. So you might be wondering, how can India, a post colonial state with one of the most valorized anti colonial movements against the British, also be a colonial power? Part of what this book aims to do is rethink how we understand colonialism and also how we understand India's state formation. There remains an attachment in scholarship, especially on South Asia, to see colonialism as happening from the West to the global South and situating our present moment as a decolonial one. But this dynamic fails to account for the power dynamic within the global South, such as that between India and Kashmir, and also fails to examine the ways in which post colonial nation states can also be colonial. One reason why some of these colonial dynamics within the global south remains obscure is that there is a sense of a geographic contiguity as well as an imagined cultural cohesion. And so these dynamics are sometimes just seen as nation building, not colonialism. So, in other words, the fact that Kashmir is geographically contiguous to India creates the possibility for a less visible kind of colonialism, such as that happens overseas between Britain and the subcontinent. But another reason involves methodological nationalism. Decades of work on Kashmir, primarily by Indian scholars, have naturalized the Indian nation state form and denied its coloniality, and as a result, have refrained from critically examining how this relationship between Kashmir and India was constructed in the first place. This has resulted in what I've referred to as epistemological violence on Kashmir, given the reflection of a colonial commitment to the integrity and territoriality of the Indian nation state form, which is then in many ways similar to uh, um, to the Indian state's own narrative that Kashmir is an integral part of India. So you can see this with a whole host of scholarship, including the ones that are on the screen, that seeks to explain what led to the armed rebellion in the 1980s and 1990s in Kashmir. And every so often, you also have the same tiresome articles explaining why Kashmiris are becoming alienated or estranged from India. In this body of work, the Kashmir issue is reduced to a crisis of federalism, a crisis of democracy, internal colonialism, secessionism, separatism, ethno nationalist insurgency, and of course, terrorism. My book examines, though, how colonialism, settler colonialism, and occupation are all important analytics to understand India's relationship with Kashmir. That is to say, India uses characteristics of each of these categories to cement its rule in Kashmir over time, and thus it is difficult to say that it is just one or the other. This is important because it encourages us not to see these categories as being in opposition to one another, but rather working in tandem in different moments to achieve particular ends for the state or to respond to local forms of resistance. In doing so, I'm not interested in asking why a people who never felt that they belonged suddenly became estranged or alienated. Rather, I'm interested in a set of inverse questions, like 1. How did India acquire Kashmir without the popular consent of its people? How did India and its client regimes normalize the occupation both within Kashmir and also for Indian and international audiences? What were the different modalities of rule that were in operation at this time? And finally, what insight can Kashmir provide us in ongoing theorizations of colonialism, settler colonialism, and occupation? To answer these questions, I look at a decade in Kashmir's recent history, from 1953 to 1963. In August 1953, Bakshi Ghulam Mohammed, who's pictured to the left, led a coup against the state of Jammu and Kashmir's first prime minister, Sheikh Abdullah, who's pictured to the right. At this time, the entire princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, which is what it was called during the British colonial period, had its own history of a rich, and it had its own history of a rich anti-monarchical uprising, had been divided between the two new nation states of India and Pakistan following the First India Pakistan War from 1947 to 1948. The United Nations had called for a plebiscite to take place once hostilities ceased so that Kashmiris could determine their future. Part of the territory, known today as Azad Kashmir and Gilgit Baltistan, came under Pakistan, while a substantial part came under Indian control. The region referred to as Jammu and Kashmir, Indian occupied Kashmir, and sometimes just Kashmir as well. So the portion in the orange, specifically here in the valley of Kashmir, is where I right from 1947, India began to colonize the part of Kashmir under its rule. It placed its own client regimes in power and negotiated some level of autonomy, which was enshrined in something called Article 370 of the Indian Constitution. The article itself was a colonial treaty meant to placate Kashmir's client regimes into thinking that being under Indian rule would provide them with significant autonomy. It allowed the state to have its own constitution, lawmaking body, and the leader of the state was even called a prime minister, unlike Indian states where the leader is called a chief minister. Residency rights of land ownership and employment were also restricted to Kashmir state subjects. The Indian government was just supposed to be in charge of communications, defense, and foreign affairs. Yet, the first Prime Minister, Sheikh Abdullah, who had initially agreed to Kashmir's accession to India, began to backtrack. He was increasingly concerned with rising Hindu nationalism, as well as the Indian government's attempts to erode the agreed upon autonomy. He was removed in a coup by India and replaced by Bakshi. Bakshi was in power for a decade from 1953 to 1963. A shrewd politician, Bakshi had been a worker for Abdullah's National Conference Party, and so he was familiar with local politics. The Indian government tasked Bakshi with promoting Kashmir's contested accession to India domestically and internationally, while repressing popular political aspirations for merger with Pakistan or independence. After violently quashing protests that arose in the aftermath of Sheikh Abdullah's arrest, Bakshi turned his attention to state building and implemented a number of educational and economic policies. During his time in power, the Kashmir Assembly, which was an undemocratic entity that was filled with loyalists of the National Conference, confirmed Kashmir's accession to India and sought greater financial and administrative integration with the Indian Union, undermining Kashmir's autonomy. Bakshi's period oversaw crucial shifts in India's political and economic relationship with Kashmir towards integration. Yet, he knew that in order for this relationship and his rule to be legitimized, Kashmiris had to be convinced that this relationship was in their best interests, and they had to develop an emotional bond in favor of India. Bakshi was also compelled to respond to the economic and social aspirations of the people, especially Kashmir's Muslim majority population that had long suffered unjust policies, especially during the princely rule period. What is astounding about his state building project is that he left no stone unturned in transforming the state and utilized a variety of actors, from bureaucrats to educators, the cultural intelligentsia, workers, peasants, tourism operators, and Indian filmmakers for this purpose. With financial assistance from the Government of India, the Kashmir government established a number of public institutions and developmental projects, including schools, colleges, and universities, hospitals, roads, tunnels, irrigation and power projects, as well as cultural centers, stadiums, and social welfare organizations. So the two photos that you see on the screen right now are from the opening of the Banihal, or what's also called the Jawahar Tunnel, in 1956. And Bakshi here in the corner, he's basically addressing the crowd that's present at this inauguration of this tunnel. And the reason why this tunnel is really important is that before this tunnel was built, there was actually no all year round link that connected the Kashmir Valley to the Indian mainland, given the mountainous terrain, the Himalayas. And so there was a road that was closed for much of the year because of snow, and so people couldn't access it all year round. And in fact, the only link that Kashmir had all year round, outside of the valley in particular, were to the parts of the subcontinent that eventually became a part of Pakistan. So places like Rawalpindi and Lahore, where there was a cart road that would go to, and so this tunnel was really important because it was seen as a very kind of concrete material way to create that all year round link between the Indian mainland as well as the Kashmir Valley. So when I began my PhD research, I found that most of the scholarship that was on Kashmir was primarily focused on the time period around partition in 1947 and what happened at that time. And then later, the 1980s and 1990s, which is when there's this armed rebellion and mass popular uprising that occurs in Kashmir against Indian rule. And so there was very little to understand that period in between these two important times. And so that's why I wanted to focus my research on that time period. And the dominant narrative about those years in between is that things were normal during this time, and that it's only because of Pakistan's interference or India's lack of commitment to development, secularism, and democracy that Kashmiris would eventually become disillusioned, and that's what led to the rebellion and intense militarization. Now, you may associate development works and efforts at prosperity by the state by building roads, tunnels, increasing employment opportunities, and enhancing tourism as laudable or good things for the people of a region. But I argue that it is precisely through the ruse of state building that India colonized Kashmir through client leaders like Bakshi. The decade that Bakshi was in power actually consolidated the contours of India's colonial occupation in Kashmir by relying on those very same discourses and practices of development, secularism, integration, normalization, and democracy. And I historicize India's occupation and show that it may have looked different in this time period in comparison to what happened in the late 1980s with the rule of India, but it was still very much involved in suppressing Kashmiri demands for self determination. So, the different chapters in the book look at the ways in which India's colonial occupation operated through Bakshi's state building practices, and specifically through international diplomacy, film, tourism, education, economic development, and cultural reform. So, these two photographs are from a very high profile visit by the Soviet leaders, Khrushchev and Bulganin, in 1956. They were invited by Prime Minister Nehru of India, but also by Bakshi. And the idea was that they would basically go around the Kashmir state and see the kind of progress that Bakshi and thus the Indian government had made in Kashmir. So they visited a lot of infrastructure, schools, and this photograph, the bigger photograph that you see, was from a cavalcade. Basically, the car was going across the across the crowd. And basically, after this visit, the Kashmir issue, which at this point was still internationalized at the United Nations, there were still a number of pending resolutions about the plebiscite. The Soviet Union basically used its veto power at the UN Security Council to side with India in all kind of subsequent resolutions. And so this visit played a really important role in kind of making what had been a very significant international concern or dispute into something that became more regionally defined. And later, of course, even more kind of sequestered to within as India's internal matter. But what I thought was really interesting about this photo is that if, of course, you see the photo, it does look like the Soviet leaders are being cheered on and there's clapping people on the sides. But I actually interviewed someone who was present at this very rally. And they told me that they and many others had basically been brought in by the state government from the towns and villages in buses and told that they were just getting a free ride and a free lunch to the city, to the capital, which is Srinagar. And so they were just told that all they would have to do is line up on the banks of the Jhelum River, and a car would pass, and they would just have to cheer. And so one of the things that the person also told me is that weren't even offered a ride back home. So people had to figure out their way back home by themselves. So this was clearly like one of these attempts at propaganda by showing the Soviet leaders that Kashmiris were happy under Indian rule, and then that would also inform how the Soviet Union would act in international forums. So I, of course, wouldn't have time to go through all of the chapters, but I'll be highlighting two main themes just so you get a sense of what this looks like. And the first is what I call the politics of life. And to give you a sense of what this means, basically during my field work, there was an older Kashmiri bureaucrat that passed away. And I found out that this person, even though he had achieved a pretty high ranking post, he actually wasn't very educated. He had only passed matric. And then he had been given or appointed a job by Bakshi on a matchbox, like a lighter matchbox. As oral histories go, there had been many in the 1950s and 60s who would come across Bakshi in his visits to their towns or villages. And he, after asking them if they had a job, would write them appointments on slips of paper or more notably on matchboxes. And so I argue that in these early years of India's colonial occupation in Kashmir, the Indian government and its client regimes saw the Kashmir issue not in political terms, meaning not a question of sovereignty or self determination, but rather in economic terms, linked to a better standard of living. Kashmiris were depicted as being malleable, that while they may have had varying political aspirations, they had the potential to be integrated subjects as long as they could experience the benefits of Indian rule. So both governments thought that Kashmiri sentiments could be managed and in many ways bought through state planning. And they attempted to show Kashmiris the many benefits that they could incur under India. And so the early years of India's colonial occupation were marked by this politics of life. And I borrow this term from the scholar Nev Gordon, who uses it similarly to describe how Israel attempted to create prosperity in the West Bank and Gaza Strip after the 1967 war by promoting agriculture, building trees, permitting Palestinians to build colleges, and even boasting of having raised the calorie intake among Gazans. And that, of course, is very eerie if we think about what's happening today. The politics of life refers to how the Indian government and its client regimes propagated development, empowerment, and progress to secure the well being of Kashmir's population and to normalize the occupation for multiple audiences. It entailed foregrounding the day to day concerns of employment, food, education, and provision of basic services. This is not to say that there was no political repression in the state. There was. Political dissent was heavily curtailed, and questions of self determination and Kashmir's political future were being suppressed. Yet it was a question of what modality was being primarily foregrounded in this moment. And so this approach to Kashmir was also furthered by the Indian leadership, including the first Indian Prime Minister, Nehru, as well as Kashmir's client regimes. So in Sheikh Abdullah, which is how I start the book, Nehru writes, it must be remembered that the people of the Kashmir Valley and roundabout, though highly gifted in many ways, in intelligence, in artisanship, etc., are not what we call a virile people. They are soft and addicted to easy living. The common people are primarily interested in a few things: an honest administration and cheap and adequate food. If they get this, then they are more or less content. And Nehru also once reportedly said that, quote, India would bind Kashmir in golden chains, end quote. And it did. The government intended to ensure that with an improved standard of living and greater prosperity, Kashmiri Muslim sentiments would shift in favor of India. Colonial and occupying powers utilize a variety of modalities of control in regions that they have colonized and where their legitimacy is challenged. One mechanism is shifting from indirect rule to direct rule, which is what we saw in the subcontinent under British colonial rule. In my research, I observed how India engaged with both the politics of life as well as more necropolitical, meaning engaging more with forms of death, modalities of control in Kashmir, sometimes even at the same time. Other times, one would be given more focus than the other. While a state governing through life and death may appear to be in contradiction, it is actually not. The idea is to entrench colonial rule and to transform political subjectivities. Depending on the context, this can be done through manifest violence, but also through strategies that seek to win hearts and minds. So, how were some of these state building measures, in fact, instruments of Indian colonization? For that, we'll turn to rice. A member of the Kashmir cabinet under Bakshi, whose name was D.P. Dar, propounded the theory that, quote, Kashmiris knew little about politics. What they cared about was a hearty meal, and they could be won over gastronomically. So you can see similarities in terms of how Nehru is talking about Kashmir and also how this gentleman is talking about Kashmir. So Sheikh Abdullah, who was the first prime minister, was invested in some form of financial autonomy for Kashmir. And he had told Kashmiris that they should rely on a diet of potatoes before they would take rice subsidies from India. But immediately after his arrest and to quell the protest, Bakshi's government received significant agricultural subsidies from India, drastically reducing the price of rice and grains. It was estimated that under Bakshi, the level of rice subsidies reached at least 16 million rupees per year. And so in some areas, the price of rice went from 60 to 70 rupees per standard unit of measurement to 8. And there were also times when the government of India would make emergency allotments of rice to Kashmir as well. Um, but what is really interesting about the story of rice in Kashmir, and this is something that I managed to find in the National Archives of India, which otherwise doesn't actually allow much access to a lot of their information on Kashmir. But in these files about allocation of rice, what I saw was Bakshi was basically negotiating with the Indian government to try to get more and more rice subsidization or low cost rice to Kashmir. So, for example, between 1956 and 1957, the Indian Ministry of Food was actually pushing back and saying that the Bakshi government was asking for too much rice, and they were not willing to provide all of the rice that they were requesting. But Bakshi basically would protest and say that the food supply in the state remained perilous, especially damaged by the Nile floods. But he also would repeatedly say that the position of Jammu and Kashmir, which is right here, was materially different from other states. Um, and that there were other political factors that the government of India should not risk with the state, as numerous political implications were involved in the reduction or the distribution of prices. And so eventually, the Indian Ministry of Home would write to the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, ask them to take in consideration the special circumstance of the state, and more rice and paddy would then be deployed. And so this example shows how important rice subsidization was to India's colonial occupation, because also it was in sharp contrast to how the government of India dealt with other states or its overall food policy, which actually relied on scarcity and self reliance. And so there's a difference in terms of how development was being done within the Kashmir context. But what's really interesting is that Bakshi was able to leverage political instability in Kashmir to get the or try to get the best deal for food aid for Kashmir, sometimes to the sheer dismay of many Indian officials. He envisioned a political economy where Kashmir would receive ongoing aid from the government of India, and so his was a time of plenty. And to get the most from the Indian government, all he had to do was refer to the political sensitivities or compulsions he was subject to. And so this is fundamentally how the politics of life operated. And the reason why this is significant is that when we look at colonial or settler colonial context, the common understanding is that these are places of immense dispossession, violence, war, and marginalization. And of course, many times they are, and that has been the predominant story in Kashmir for decades as well. But then only seeing colonialism as being defined by manifest violence obscures our understandings of the other ways in which it can operate through giving, development, and empowerment. This is what defined the early decades of India's rule in Kashmir. As a result of such policies, India was able to position Kashmir as a begging bowl and itself as singularly capable of providing the people their livelihood, entrenching its colonial occupation of Kashmir through fiscal and not direct military means. So, the politics of life was first. The second theme that I want to discuss briefly is about secularism and what exactly the secularism entails if India's secular credentials are viewed in the context of the colonial occupation. Indian leaders like Nehru would basically say that India's secular ideals are exemplified through the fact that its only Muslim majority state, Kashmir, chose to join India. So you might think then that when it came to representations of Kashmir in the broader discursive domain, Kashmir's Muslim histories or geographies might at least be made reference to, especially if they were supposed to have upheld Indian secularism. But this was not the case. To say Kashmir was a Muslim majority region that had chosen to join India was largely good PR for international audiences. Domestically, in secular nationalist imaginaries of Kashmir, Kashmir was presented as a Hindu space and the heart of Indian civilization from the ancient to present times. How then do we make sense of Indian secularism at this time? My book argues that Indian secularism and Hindu majoritarianism are inextricable to each other. I show how Hindu geographies, imaginaries, and histories, especially through the sole reliance on the 12th century Sanskrit text, the Rajatarangini by Kalhana, were central to secular discourses. Producing a good secular subject was deployed as a mechanism to criminalize Muslim political aspirations as well as alternate visions of nationhood. Ultimately, Kashmiri Muslims were politically useful for India's secular politics of inclusion, but this forcible inclusion is aligned with assimilationist settler colonial narratives about Kashmir's history and recent past. As the book shows, secular was used to both erase and tame Muslim histories of Kashmir. One of the ways in which this comes about is through film and tourism. Film and tourism have served in many ways to territorialize India's colonial occupation in Kashmir and continues to do so. Both have sought to produce Indian colonial desires, anxieties, and claims over the occupied territory and define the place on India's terms. Dozens of leading Indian films from this time were made in Kashmir, and Kashmir was often referred to as the top tourist destination in India. It was a place to be seen and experienced, even if just through the cinematic lens, and in turn to claim. The use of tourism, in particular, to enable colonialism is, of course, not restricted to Kashmir. In this 1952 ad from the State of Hawaii Visitors Bureau, you can see some of the similarities in the ways that tourism ads to Hawaii function to create a space of gender desire, and there are others that do the same for Kashmir as well. And in both of these ads, there's an attempt to show like how visitors can go there all year round, and there's activities that people can do all year round. And also how easy, right? How easy it is now to get to these territories that are at the margin of the nation as well. And so this continues until the present. This is an ad from 2020 after the Indian government pronounced that Kashmir was reopened for tourism since the abrogation, which I'll get to in a bit. And so you can see some of the similarities, even in terms of the language that Kashmir is calling here. Kashmir is also calling here. So it's been calling for a really long time. Using film and tourism, I argue that representations of Kashmir's history and identity were selective, partial, and distorting, ignoring complex historical processes and providing a simplified narrative of Kashmir's natural incorporation into the Indian nation. In their travels, Indian tourists saw and experienced Kashmir in ways that legitimated India's symbolic claims over Kashmir. In tourist guidebooks, Kashmir's Muslim histories were either completely erased or relegated, as is what happens across the subcontinent, to stories of invaders. For example, Muslim rulers were referred to as conquerors, whereas earlier Hindu or Buddhist rulers, despite their varied origins, were seen as indigenous to Kashmir. Muslim sacred sites were given a brief mention, while Hindu sacred sites were central to the tourist experience. Few of the Kashmir films even depicted any Kashmiri Muslim characters, and again, this is surprising given that over 90% of the population is Muslim, and especially in the valley specifically. The ones that did were either simplistic and rustic, like Mangur in the film Armor, or Raja, played by Shashi Kapoor in the film Jab Jab Puri, you see pictures. It was also during this time that Hindu religious pilgrimage to Kashmir was strengthened. As one guidebook mentioned, Kashmir was a holy land for Hindus. Benares stands as a molehill before a mountain. Many guidebooks also had a special section on the Amarnath pilgrimage, heightening the significance of Kashmir for the Hindu faithful. So, why is all of this significant? Critics of settler colonialism have argued that not all states eliminate subject populations by killing them off or driving them off the land. The elimination can also occur by assimilation, or what I call integration in the book, where the idea is to rid the people of their own sense of history and identity and bring them into line with the settler colonial state. In this case, India's politics of secular inclusion linked to the erasure or taming of Muslimness and making Kashmir exclusively a Hindu holy land was intimately tied to processes of settler colonialism in order to legitimate India's claims over Kashmir. Different aspects of the state building process, though, created their own subversions. Bakshi himself was replaced by the Indian government once he stopped serving their purpose. This is the fate of Kashmir's client politicians up until today. Even though his time in power completely entrenched the legal, political, economic, and social infrastructure of colonial occupation, it did not actually succeed in emotionally integrating Kashmiris to India. In fact, the decades after his rule led to even greater popular movements for self determination. Now, I wanted to end this overview by bringing it to the present. As many of you may know, on August 2019, India embarked on the next phase of its settler colonial project by formally revoking Kashmir's semi autonomous status. It's not an exaggeration to say that since then, Kashmiris have been effectively silenced as India has changed a series of laws to allow its citizens and armed forces to buy land and settle in the region in order to change the demographics in favor of Indians and quash a long standing movement for self determination. In recent years, the Indian government has completely gone after all forms of political dissent in Kashmir, from imprisoning the pro freedom leadership to targeting writers, journalists, artists, academics, human rights defenders, and activists in a variety of ways, and also creating new forms of propaganda. Writing or saying anything that portrays the Indian government's actions in a negative light, not to even speak of freedom or liberation, is a cause for harassment, interrogation, and imprisonment. Much of this is also being replicated in India as political developments under Modi's Hindu nationalist government have led to fears of genocide against Indian Muslims. Examining Indian state formation from the perspective of Kashmir, however, sheds light on India's descent into an authoritarian, undemocratic Hindu majoritarian state. In scholarship and advocacy efforts against Hindu nationalism, there's a tendency to reinforce this idea that India was once secular, once pluralist, and democratic, but it has only now been transformed into the state that commits human rights violations. There's, of course, no question that the
I'm sorry to interrupt you. There are some complaints because there is some noise coming from your mic. There is a micro traffic. So, I mean, if you can fix that because we hear noise in the background. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
Sorry about that. Is it a little better now?
Now it's good.
Okay. Sorry.
All right. No problem.
There's no question that the rise of Hindu nationalism has exacerbated India's challenges, and of course, things have gotten categorically worse. Yet, with this increasing nostalgia for an earlier version of India, because of rampant Hindu nationalism in India today, the inherent violence of that secular liberal order, as well as its own entanglements with Hindu majoritarianism, is erased. This erasure basically completely denies the fact that colonialism and domination were at the root of Indian nation state formation, and potentially not just in Kashmir as well. In some ways, we can see Kashmir and other zones of colonial occupation as a test case for the Indian state to practice various forms of power, disciplinary, necropolitical, sovereign, as well as the politics of life. And these strategies would be utilized in the mainland as well, especially against populations like Muslims, Dalits, Adivasis, and more recently, anyone who doesn't align with the Hindu nationalist project. Zones of colonial occupation help us think about how nation states can slide into varying political formations, because it is often these zones that go from being a state of exception to the norm. And so instead of looking for inspiration in a rather uninspiring past, would it not be better to envision more imaginative and liberatory futures? And finally, even though this book aims to shed light on Kashmir's history, my hope is that it will be useful to think through other sites that are like Kashmir. One of my main hopes is that this book will contribute towards a historiography of states that do not exist, haven't been allowed to exist, and people who have been denied their self determination. And there are many of these places. Kashmir is not exceptional in this way. A number of other nations and communities have been brought into the fold of nation states without their consent and remain under colonial occupation, apartheid, and war. Modern day borders do not adhere to people's understandings of place and history. And so modern nation states have used varying modalities of control, whether it is manifest violence or the politics of life, to establish their rule in these places where they lack legitimacy. But people have and continue to resist. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Hafsa, for your excellent presentation. I presume that we should have many from our participants would like to have questions. So I would suggest that questions be submitted in written form so that we can read them to you, or you can read them yourselves, and then you can respond. So